The wind in the valley carried the smell of old timber and dust, the kind that clung to your coat and never truly left. I had ridden for 3 days before I saw it, a crooked shack leaning against the horizon like it was too tired to stand. That shack was supposed to be my hiding place, the end of all things that had a name or a memory. I bought it for $50 and a promise that no one around here would ask questions. The man who sold it said it used to belong to a trapper who died in winter. I told him I wasn't planning to last that long. He laughed, thinking I was joking, but there was no laughter in me left to share. The town of Dry Creek sat half a mile west, just beyond a stretch of dying cottonwoods and a narrow creek that sounded like a whisper at night. Folks said the place used to be a boomtown when the gold rush hit, but the dust took back everything men tried to claim. All that remained were wooden porches that groaned in the wind, a few lanterns glowing in the dark, and a small church bell that hadn't rung in years. It was quiet enough for a man like me, a man trying to forget the sound of gunfire, of betrayal, of someone calling his name and never getting an answer back. The shack had no floorboards left in places, and rainwater slipped through the roof in thin lines, but I didn't mind. I'd come here to bury the past, not to live in comfort. There was something honest about the way the land didn't pretend to welcome you. The soil was dry and cracked, the fence posts broken, the hills gray with age. Every night when the wind moaned through the gaps, it felt like the earth itself was remembering things it wished it could forget. Maybe that's why I stayed. I wanted to belong somewhere that carried the same kind of scars. It was on the second morning, while I was fixing the door hinge, that I first saw her. She lived in the house next to the shack, a place that had once been painted white but now wore a skin of dust and peeling boards. A widow, that's what the storekeeper in town had said. Lost her husband in a mining accident 2 winters ago. She had a son, maybe 10 years old, who chopped wood near the fence line while she hung laundry that the wind kept trying to steal. I wasn't looking for conversation, but it's strange how the lonely find each other even when they don't mean to. She didn't speak the first few times we crossed paths, just nodded, sometimes offering a faint smile, the kind people give out of courtesy rather than kindness. I could tell she'd been through her own kind of grief. The way she stood, shoulders straight but tired, told me she was used to holding things together, not because she wanted to, but because no one else would. Every sound in that valley carried. When her boy laughed, it reached me like an echo from a life I'd left behind. That night, as I sat by the small fire behind my shack, I found myself watching the light flicker across her porch. She was sitting there sewing by lamplight, her boy asleep in a chair beside her. For reasons I couldn't name, it made something inside me ache. I'd spent years trying to numb myself from feeling anything at all. But that scene, simple and quiet, felt like a door opening somewhere I thought was long shut. Still, I turned away. A man with my past had no right to dream about beginnings. Days passed in silence, marked only by the rhythm of small tasks, chopping wood, fixing fences, patching the roof. But even in the stillness, I could feel her presence. Sometimes she'd leave a loaf of bread on the fence post between our homes. Other times, I'd mend a piece of her fence that had broken overnight. Neither of us ever mentioned these small exchanges. Maybe we both knew that words could ruin what silence had carefully built. One afternoon, a storm rolled down from the hills, heavy, angry, and cold. I saw her struggling to gather the laundry before the rain hit. Without thinking, I ran to help. We worked together beneath that gray sky, her hands trembling as thunder cracked overhead. When the last sheet was pulled in, she looked at me, really looked at me, and something unspoken passed between us. It wasn't love, not yet. It was recognition. 2 broken souls, both trying to start over in a place the world had forgotten. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the rain drum against the earth. The smell of wet soil brought back memories I'd buried deep. A battlefield far away, a promise I couldn't keep, a woman who had waited for me and never saw me return. I thought I'd buried all of that with the man I used to be, but the widow's quiet strength stirred it all up again. Maybe that's what frightened me most. Not the past, but the idea that I might start caring again. The boy began visiting sometimes, saying his mother sent him with fresh milk or biscuits. He'd ask questions about my tools, my horse, the scar that ran down my arm. I told him little. Kids didn't need to carry a man's ghosts, but when he smiled, I found myself answering more than I planned to. He reminded me of who I might have been if life had turned out different. One evening, the widow came by herself. The rain had ended, but the sky still carried the color of sorrow. She said her roof was leaking again and asked if I could take a look. Inside her home, it smelled of lavender and old books. On the wall hung a picture and her husband, I assumed, a man with gentle eyes. I felt out of place, like a shadow wandering into light. She noticed the way I hesitated and said softly, "We all got something we wish we could forget." I didn't answer, but she didn't seem to need me to. That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of the creak, the whisper of wind against the window. Everything seemed alive with memories I didn't want. I'd bought this shack to hide from the world, to let the past rot quietly. But now the world was knocking again, wearing the face of a woman who refused to give up. The next morning, I found her boy waiting by my fence, holding a basket of apples. "Mama said thank you," he mumbled. Then he added, "She worries about you." That caught me off guard. No one had worried about me in years. I took the basket and for the first time in a long while, I smiled. Not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that admits it's still there. Life in Dry Creek moved slowly, but something inside me began to change. The sun felt warmer, the nights less empty. I caught myself looking for her on the porch, listening for her voice carried by the wind. She had become the heartbeat of this forgotten valley, and somehow she'd stirred mine back to life. Still, not everything in the past stays buried. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the road. Tall, wearing a worn military coat that hadn't seen peace in years. He stopped at the general store, asked questions about me. Folks said he carried a badge from back east. The moment I heard, the air turned colder. I'd known this day might come. The past never lets go without a fight. As the sun set over the hills, I stood outside the shack, the air heavy with dust and memory. Across the field, the widow's lamp flickered through her window, soft and warm. Part of me wanted to go to her, to confess everything before the man from my past arrived. But the other part, the darker part, knew that some stories don't end in peace. I tightened my coat against the wind, watching the light fade from the sky. Somewhere out there, my past was riding closer, and for the first time in years, I had something to lose again. The days that followed carried a strange stillness, the kind that made a man listen too closely to the wind. I went about my chores the same as before, chopping wood, repairing the corral, cleaning the rifle I told myself I'd never use again. But my thoughts kept circling back to that rider. Folks said he'd left town the next morning, heading north, but I knew better. Men like him didn't ride halfway across the country for nothing. He was looking for me, and sooner or later he'd find what he came for. Still, I didn't tell the widow. There were things a person shouldn't have to carry. Each evening I saw her tending her small garden, her son helping her plant turnips and mend the fence. She looked so calm, unaware of the storm inching closer. I wanted to keep it that way. She'd given me back a piece of something I thought was gone forever. Hope, maybe. Or just the quiet comfort of being seen. And that made me afraid, because I knew from experience that anything good in my life never lasted long. Sometimes, I'd sit outside at night and watch the stars slide above the valley. The desert stretched endlessly, whispering with coyotes and memories. The shack's walls creaked in the wind, and the faint scent of her cooking drifted across the field. I'd catch myself thinking about the warmth of her voice, the way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I was just lonely, that's all. But deep down, I knew better. A week later, while I was splitting logs, I heard the sound of hooves on the trail. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the axe and looked up, but it wasn't the man from before. It was the widow's boy, riding an old gray mule. He slid off the saddle and said his mother had taken sick. Fever, he thought. I followed him without a word. Her house felt different that day. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of boiled herbs and damp wood. She was lying on the bed, pale, sweat shining on her forehead. She looked smaller than I remembered, fragile in a way that made something twist in my chest. I found water, wiped her face, and tried to keep her breathing steady. The boy sat near the door, watching me like I was doing something sacred. For hours I stayed there, listening to the old clock tick and her faint, uneven breaths. When the fever finally broke, she opened her eyes, and for a moment, she didn't look at me like a stranger. "Thank you," she whispered, voice weak but certain. I told her not to thank me, but she smiled, soft, tired, and real, and said, "You came anyway." That night I walked home under a sky full of stars that didn't seem so cold anymore. For the first time in years I prayed, not to be forgiven, but to be allowed a little more time. Maybe fate was giving me a second chance, maybe not. Either way, I wasn't ready to lose what I'd just begun to find. In the following days, I visited often, helping her fix things around the house while she regained her strength. Sometimes we didn't talk much. Other times, she'd ask about my life before Dry Creek. I told her what I could, that I'd worked the rails for a while, that I'd done some soldiering, that I'd been places better forgotten. I left out the rest, the reason men had once feared my name, the mistake that sent me running west. She seemed to sense there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Maybe she knew what it was like to live with ghosts. Her husband had been a miner, she told me one evening as we sat by her porch. The earth took him before his time. She'd stayed because it was the only place their boy had ever known. There was pride in her voice when she spoke of him, but also a quiet sadness that mirrored my own. That night, when the wind carried the smell of rain again, she said softly, "You don't have to stay here alone forever." I didn't answer. I just looked out into the dark where my shack stood, the place I'd bought to bury everything that came before her. But the world doesn't let you bury your past so easily. The next morning, I found fresh tracks near the creek. Horse tracks. A single rider, heavy boots, spurred heels. I followed them a short way before they vanished into the brush. He was watching, maybe waiting. The memory of that military coat came back to me, and with it the voice of my old commanding officer, cold, firm, and accusing. There had been an ambush years ago, men left behind, orders disobeyed. They said I'd deserted. They said I'd run, but that wasn't the truth. I hadn't deserted. I'd been betrayed. That thought haunted me all afternoon. I tried to work, to clear my head, but the weight of it pressed too hard. When dusk came, I saw the widow standing by her fence watching the horizon. "You look troubled," she said quietly. I almost told her everything right then. About the letter, the lost platoon, the man I'd shot to survive, but the words caught in my throat. What good would it do? The past couldn't be undone, and dragging her into it would only bring her pain. Still, she reached across the fence and placed her hand over mine. "You don't owe me your story," she said, "but you don't have to face it alone." That simple kindness hit deeper than any sermon ever could. I wanted to tell her how much it meant, how she'd brought light back into a place I thought was all shadows. But before I could, a noise came from the ridge, a horse neighing, the sound of boots striking rock. I turned, hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning by the door. Whoever was out there wasn't passing through. He was watching again. That night, the valley felt different. The moon was low and red, the kind of color that reminded me of battlefields. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with the rifle across my lap, listening for movement. Every creak of the shack made my heart thud. Around midnight, I saw a flicker, a lantern moving slowly along the creek. He was closer now. Maybe he thought I'd come quietly when the time came. He didn't know me well enough for that. By morning, the tracks were gone, washed away by rain, but I knew he'd be back. So I packed a small bag, a pistol, some cartridges, and the letter I'd kept all these years, the one that proved what really happened. I didn't know whether to run or to stand my ground, but I did know one thing. If that man came near the widow or her boy, I'd face whatever hell was waiting for me. Later that day, I saw her again, hanging laundry in the breeze. She looked peaceful, unaware of how close danger was. Her son was chasing a stray chicken through the yard, laughing. I stood there for a long time, watching them, thinking about how easily a life can turn. One moment of peace, one wrong step, and everything shatters. That's what fear does. It makes you see the end before it even comes. She called out to me, asking if I wanted supper that evening. I wanted to say no, to keep my distance, to protect her from whatever was coming. But when she smiled, I couldn't refuse. Just for a while, I told myself. Just for tonight. Inside her home, everything felt warm. The light, the smell of stew, the sound of her boy humming quietly. It had been years since I'd sat at a table like that. Years since I'd felt like I belonged anywhere. She asked about my family, and I said they were gone. She nodded as if she already knew. "Sometimes," she said, "we build walls around our hearts so tall, we forget why we built them in the first place." I looked at her, and for a moment, I wanted to believe that maybe this was my chance, that I could stay, help her, live quietly. But outside, the wind howled against the shutters, and I saw a shadow move near the barn. My body went cold. He was still there, watching, waiting. I excused myself and stepped outside, gripping the rifle. The night was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a man's instincts crawl. I walked toward the barn, boots sinking in the mud. Inside, I found nothing but tools and hay, though the back door was open, swinging gently. Whoever had been there was gone. For now. When I turned back, the widow stood on her porch, the lamp flickering beside her. She didn't ask what I'd seen. Maybe she could tell by the look in my eyes. The wind tugged at her dress, her face half in shadow. "Whoever you're running from," she said softly, "don't let him take what's left of your peace." I didn't know what to say. The words stuck somewhere deep. All I could do was nod, the sound of the wind filling the space between us. And as I walked back to my shack, the truth hit me harder than any bullet ever had. I hadn't just bought that shack to bury my past. I'd bought it because I didn't think I deserved a future. But now, because of her, I wanted one. And that meant the man coming for me had to be stopped, even if it meant facing everything I'd tried to run from. In the distance, thunder rumbled again, and the smell of rain mixed with smoke. Something was coming, something that would change everything before the dawn. The next few days brought no word, only silence that seemed to weigh heavier with every passing hour. The widow still smiled when I came by, but I could see it in her eyes. She felt something in the air too. A kind of warning, quiet but sharp, like the way the wind shifts before a storm. I tried to act like nothing was wrong. I fixed her fence, helped her son with his lessons, even shared a few laughs at supper. But every sound from the ridge made my hand twitch toward the rifle. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just from a distance, but from the shadows of my own past. One evening, I rode into town, hoping to learn if the stranger had been seen again. The general store was quiet except for the creak of the old sign and the smell of stale tobacco. The storekeeper, a thin man with a nervous twitch, avoided my eyes when I asked. He said a man had come through again 2 nights earlier, tall, clean-shaven, with a scar across his jaw. Bought supplies, didn't talk much, but asked if anyone around here kept to himself near the edge of the valley. The storekeeper said he didn't tell him anything, but I could tell by his trembling hands that he wasn't sure whether to believe his own words. When I rode back, the moon was high, and the shack looked smaller than ever against the empty plains. I checked my rifle again, counting the rounds like a prayer. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw faces, the men I'd lost in that canyon years ago, and the officer who'd blamed me for it. His voice echoed through the years, cold and steady. "You'll answer for what you've done." Maybe he was the one on the trail now, or maybe it was someone sent in his place. Either way, my peace was hanging by a single thread. By morning, I decided I couldn't just wait. I needed to know who he was and what he wanted. I saddled my horse and followed the creek north where the land rose into ridges and scattered pine. The trail was faint, but there were tracks, the same spurred boots as before. They led toward an old abandoned mine at the edge of the hills. I remembered hearing stories about that place, how a few men tried reopening it years after the collapse, but strange accidents had driven them out. Now it was silent, the entrance boarded but half-caved, like a mouth that had tried to swallow too much sorrow. I dismounted and walked closer, the wind whispering through broken boards. There were ashes from a campfire still warm. Someone had been here recently, and then I saw it, a small scrap of paper wedged under a rock. I picked it up and unfolded it carefully. It was a wanted poster, old and creased, but my name was still clear at the top. My face younger but unmistakable. The charge, desertion and murder. I felt the ground tilt under me. They'd kept my story alive after all these years. As I turned the paper over, I heard the snap of a twig. A shadow moved between the trees, too fast to be the wind. I raised the rifle but didn't fire. The shape vanished into the brush, the sound of hooves fading down the ridge. Whoever he was, he wanted me to know he was close. I pocketed the paper and headed back, heart pounding, the truth pressing heavier with every step. When I reached the widow's house, her boy was waiting at the gate. He ran to me, breathless, saying a man had come by asking questions, said he was a lawman looking for someone dangerous. She told him she didn't know anyone like that, but the look on her face when I entered told me she knew the man was after me. Inside, the air was thick with quiet fear. She didn't speak at first, just looked at me the way one looks at a storm on the horizon. Finally, she said, "Tell me the truth. Who is he?" I took a long breath. I'd run from this moment for too long, so I told her, not everything, but enough. About the ambush the men left behind, how I'd disobeyed orders to save civilians, how the officer blamed me when it went wrong, how I'd fled when they came for me, leaving behind my name and everything tied to it. I told her I wasn't proud, but I wasn't guilty of the things written on that paper either. When I finished, she just stood there, eyes glistening in the lamplight. "So you came here to bury what they made of you? she said softly. I nodded. And now it's come to find you. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the clock ticking, slow and steady. Finally, she said, You saved me once when I was sick. Let me help you now. I told her she didn't need to get involved, but she shook her head. You think I haven't faced fear before? The world doesn't give us much choice. Her courage both steadied and scared me. I didn't want her or the boy caught in what was coming. I promised her I'd handle it, that I'd leave if I had to. But when I looked into her eyes, I knew leaving wouldn't protect her. The man hunting me wouldn't stop at my door, not if he thought she was part of my story. The next day, I rode to the edge of town again. There were whispers this time, people glancing at me, conversations stopping mid-sentence. News travels fast in small places. I stopped at the blacksmith's, hoping for a word of truth. He nodded grimly and said the stranger was still around, staying in the old boarding house by the livery. Said he'd been flashing a badge and asking about a fugitive soldier. I thanked him and rode back slow, thinking of what came next. That night, I made a choice. I would confront him, not out of anger, but because running hadn't given me peace, only more ghosts. Before dawn, I saddled up and rode to the boarding house. The door creaked as I stepped inside. The keeper pointed upstairs without a word. I climbed quietly, my boots heavy on the steps. At the end of the hall, a door stood half open, lamplight spilling through. I pushed it gently. He was there, older than I remembered, gray in the beard but the same cold eyes. The badge glinted on his coat. He looked at me and smiled faintly. Didn't take you long, he said. His voice hadn't changed. You know why I'm here, I nodded. You've been chasing a ghost. I'm not who you think I am anymore. He leaned back, studying me. A man doesn't stop being what he's done. There's a ledger and you've got debts on yours. We talked for a long time. Not shouting, not fighting. Just the kind of words that cut deep because they carry history. He said the army wanted closure. I told him there was no justice in lies. I showed him the letter. Proof that orders had been forged, that I'd been set up to take the fall. For the first time I saw doubt in his eyes. But doubt wasn't enough. He said the past couldn't be rewritten, only ended. You can't outrun who you are, he murmured, hand hovering near his gun. When I left that building, the sun was rising over the hills, painting the sky red. I hadn't drawn my weapon, but I could feel the weight of the confrontation pressing down like stone. He wasn't done. I could see it in the way he watched me leave, like a wolf waiting for the right moment. Back at the shack, the widow met me at the fence. She didn't ask what had happened, but she knew. There was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and faith. You don't have to fight this alone, she said. I told her I didn't want to bring danger to her door. It's already here, she whispered. Later that evening, a storm rolled over the valley, dark and low. Lightning flashed across the hills, and for a brief second, I saw a figure standing by the ridge, motionless, waiting. I knew then it wouldn't be long. The man who carried my past was coming for me, and this time there would be no running. Inside, the widow sat by the fire, her boy asleep on her lap. I watched them quietly, knowing that peace was a fragile thing. My hand shook as I checked my rifle one last time. The wind beat against the windows, rattling the old walls. I stepped outside, rain hitting my face, the smell of gunpowder already in the air. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse neighed, and I knew the time for hiding was over. The valley had gone silent, too silent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I stood in the open, staring into the storm, waiting for the man who would decide whether I was meant to die with my past, or finally live free of it. The storm had not passed by morning. It lingered over Dry Creek like a curse, rolling thunder over the valley and turning the ground to thick mud. The sky stayed dark and the wind pushed against the walls of my shack like it wanted to tear them down. I hadn't slept. Every sound kept me on edge. The rattle of the roof, the creak of the porch, the far-off cry of coyotes that somehow sounded too close. The man who had come for me was still out there, waiting for the right moment. I could feel it in my bones, that pull between what I wanted to protect and what I could no longer hide from. By noon, the rain had slowed, and mist hung low across the field. I saw the widow walking toward my shack, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her son trailing behind with a small basket of bread. I stepped outside, rifle still leaning against the door. Her eyes went straight to it. "He's still here, isn't he?" she asked quietly. I nodded. She glanced back at her boy and sent him home, saying she'd follow in a minute. Once he was gone, she said, You can't stay here waiting for him to strike first. That's not living. I told her I didn't have a choice. Men like him didn't quit until they got what they came for. She looked at me for a long time, her expression steady and brave. You once told me you came here to bury your past, she said. But maybe this isn't about burying it. Maybe it's about facing it so it finally stops haunting you. Her words hit hard. I wanted to believe her, but part of me still thought the only way to end it was to disappear for good. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint echo of a horse from the ridge. We both froze. She turned her head toward the sound, her hand tightening around her shawl. I knew that rhythm, the slow, deliberate gait of a man who wasn't in a hurry because he already knew where he was going. I told her to go inside, but she didn't move. If he's coming for you, he'll come through me too, she said. I didn't argue. There wasn't time. I went to the barn checking my supplies. The horse was restless, sensing the tension. I loaded the rifle, every click of metal louder than thunder. My hands were steady now, though my heart wasn't. The sky outside dimmed again, heavy clouds rolling in from the east. The valley was a gray blur, the hills hidden behind mist. I knew this was the calm before it broke. By late afternoon, the widow's boy came running to the shack, shouting that a rider had been seen near the old trail leading down from the hills. I saddled up without a word, told the widow to lock the doors and stay low. She tried to stop me, but there was something in her eyes that said she knew I wouldn't listen. I told her I'd end this before nightfall. The trail wound through the ravine, narrow and slick with mud. My horse struggled for footing, hooves sliding on wet stone. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of pine and rain. Halfway up the ridge, I saw the smoke, thin, gray, and fresh. He was close. I dismounted, tied the reins to a stump, and started up on foot. Each step made my heart beat louder than the thunder overhead. Near the top, I found him waiting. He was sitting by a dying fire, his horse grazing nearby. He didn't reach for his gun when he saw me. He just looked up, calm and almost tired, like he'd been expecting me to come all along. You could have kept running, he said. But I knew you wouldn't. You're too proud for that. I'm not proud, I said. Just tired of being hunted. He stood slowly, brushing ash from his coat. Then you should have faced this years ago. I took a step closer, my boots sinking into the mud. I tried. You didn't give me the chance. You needed someone to blame. His eyes flickered, the first sign of emotion I'd seen in him. You think I wanted this? I lost men that day, good men. You walked away. I told him about the orders, the ambush, the letter that proved I'd been set up. He listened, his jaw tight, rain running down his face. For a moment I thought I saw doubt again, real doubt, but then his hand went to his gun. Doesn't matter anymore, he said quietly. Dead men can't defend themselves, but I can still make this right. The next few seconds stretched thin as wire. Neither of us spoke. I could hear the rain falling harder now, each drop striking the ground like the ticking of a clock counting down. My finger brushed the trigger, but I didn't raise the rifle. I didn't want it to end like this. He must have seen that hesitation, because his eyes softened just a little. You were a good soldier once, he said. Don't make me put you down like a thief. Before I could answer, thunder cracked so loud it shook the ground. The horses spooked, and for a moment we both looked away. Then came the gunshot. Not his, not mine, but from somewhere down the slope. We both turned, startled. Another shot followed, closer this time. He ducked behind a rock and I hit the dirt, mud splattering across my coat. Someone else was out there. I peered through the rain and saw movement among the trees. A rider on a dark horse circling toward us. The lawman cursed under his breath. You brought someone else? He shouted. I shook my head. Whoever it was, I didn't recognize them. The rider fired again, the bullet striking close enough to spray dirt across my boots. I crawled behind cover and aimed, but the rain made it near impossible to see clearly. The rider dismounted and disappeared into the brush. The lawman and I looked at each other, both realizing the same thing. This wasn't part of either man's plan. Looks like your past wasn't the only one with ghosts, he muttered. Then he drew his gun and moved into the trees. I followed a few paces behind, careful, alert, every sense sharpened. The woods were thick with fog, branches cracked underfoot, the smell of wet pine mixed with gunpowder. I heard footsteps shifting in the dark, quick and light. Then a voice, low, sharp, familiar. You shouldn't have come back here. My chest tightened. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, one I thought belonged to the dead. I turned slowly and saw him. A man I'd once called a friend. He'd been part of the same unit, left behind during that cursed ambush. I'd thought he'd died, but here he was, alive and wild-eyed. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt, but his eyes burned with anger. "They told me you ran," he said, his voice shaking. "I waited. I watched men die waiting for you to come back. You left us there." The truth hit me like a hammer. He was the reason this new storm had come. He must have found the lawman, told his side of the story, maybe even twisted it to draw me out. "You don't understand," I said, taking a cautious step forward. "I tried to go back. They stopped me." He raised his gun, hands trembling. "Don't lie to me. You gotta start over. You got to live." Before I could answer, he fired. The shot tore through a tree trunk inches from my shoulder. I dropped to the ground, rolled behind a rock, and fired back. The lawman returned fire too, thinking the shot had come for him. The woods erupted in chaos. 3 men, 3 pasts colliding under the same dark sky. The thunder swallowed every other sound, the rain turning the ground slick and red. I could barely see, barely breathe. Every flash of lightning showed me faces twisted by hate and regret. I shouted for them to stop, but my voice was drowned out. At one point, I saw the lawman stumble, clutching his arm. I crawled over to drag him behind cover, the old instinct kicking in. Save whoever you can, even if he came to kill you. The former friend was still shouting from the trees, accusing me, crying, firing wild. "You left us!" He screamed again, his voice breaking. The lawman looked at me, pain tightening his face. "Is it true?" he rasped. I didn't answer. There was no explaining in a storm like this. I only knew that whatever happened next would end everything. The running, the guilt, the silence. Then I heard a sound that froze my blood. A faint cry from far down the slope. The widow's boy. I turned and saw him at the edge of the ridge, soaked, frightened, clutching something small and metallic. My old medal, the one I'd buried behind the shack. He must have followed me. Lightning flashed again, and the rider in the woods saw him too. I shouted his name, telling him to run, but before he could move, another gunshot split the air. The boy froze, his eyes wide with terror. I dropped my rifle and ran toward him, slipping in the mud, heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. Behind me, the lawman shouted for me to stop. Another shot rang out closer, echoing through the valley like the toll of a bell. The storm broke loose all at once, wind howling, rain slashing sideways. I reached the boy, grabbing him by the shoulders, pulling him close. He was trembling, staring at the trees behind me. I turned. Out of the mist, both men were emerging. One bleeding, one furious, both aiming their guns. The 3 of us stood frozen, every breath sharp as glass. The past, the truth, and the innocent all caught in the same narrow space, the same dying storm. And in that heartbeat of silence before the next shot, I finally understood. There was no burying the past. There never had been. There was only the moment you decided what kind of man you would be when it came to claim you. The thunder cracked again, and the world went white. When the thunder rolled and the flash blinded the valley, it felt like the whole world stopped breathing. For one stretched heartbeat, the wind, the rain, and even time itself froze. Then came the echo of the shot, one sharp sound that seemed to split the storm in half. I didn't know who had fired or who had fallen, only that the sound carried the weight of everything we'd run from. When the light faded, the air smelled of wet soil and gunpowder, and I saw the lawman drop to one knee, his gun slipping from his grasp. My former friend stood trembling, the barrel of his pistol smoking in the rain. The boy clung to me, shaking, his small hands gripping my coat. I pulled him behind a rock and turned back toward the clearing. The man who'd once shared my foxhole, who'd once laughed beside a campfire and called me brother, was standing there like a ghost risen out of the past. His eyes flickered between me and the lawman, wild with confusion, fear, and something close to regret. For a long moment, none of us moved. The only sound was the steady drumming of rain. Then, with a kind of broken exhaustion, he lowered his weapon. "I didn't come to kill you," he said, his voice cracking. "I just wanted you to see what you left behind." I stepped forward slowly, hands raised. "I never left you," I said. I was ordered to stand down. "They told me everyone in that canyon was gone. By the time I got back, the place was ashes." He stared at me for a long time before his shoulders finally slumped. The gun slipped from his fingers and hit the mud. He fell to his knees, weeping like a man who'd carried too much grief for too many years. I went to him, helped him up, and for the first time since the war, we stood together again. Broken, older, and tired, but still alive. The lawman had been hit in the shoulder. I tore a piece of cloth from my coat and pressed it against the wound. He didn't resist. He just looked at me, the fight gone from his eyes. "Maybe we were all wrong," he muttered. "Maybe none of us were meant to make sense of it." We waited out the storm in silence. When the thunder faded and the clouds began to break apart, The valley came back to life. The distant cry of a hawk, the faint sound of the creek below, the wet smell of the earth after rain. The boy sat quietly beside me, watching the mist lift off the hills like ghosts finally finding rest. By sunrise, we made our way back down. The lawman rode slow, pale and weak, but still breathing. My old comrade followed a few paces behind, eyes fixed on the horizon. None of us spoke much. There wasn't anything left to say that the night hadn't already taken. When we reached the widow's house, she came running from the porch, her face pale with worry. The boy ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She held him close, then looked up at me, her eyes full of a mix of relief and disbelief. I told her it was over, though I wasn't sure what over really meant anymore. She helped me tend to the wounded lawman, wrapping his arm in boiling water for him to drink. He didn't threaten to arrest me anymore. Maybe he'd seen enough truth to understand that the world wasn't as simple as the reports made it. He said he'd tell the army I was dead, that the case could stay buried where it belonged. It was the closest thing to mercy a man like me could hope for. As for my old friend, he stayed for a few days. We spoke sometimes quietly about the men we'd lost and the choices that had scarred us both. There was forgiveness between us, though not the kind that heals everything, more like the kind that lets you finally breathe. When he left, he said he'd head north, maybe try mining, maybe just wander. I watched him ride away, knowing I'd likely never see him again. The widow's boy followed him until he disappeared down the trail, then looked back at me. "Are you going to leave too?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I didn't know. Part of me still felt like that fugitive, the man who'd bought a shack to bury everything he'd ever been. But another part, something smaller, quieter and stronger, wanted to stay. That night, after the house had gone still, I walked down to the creek. The moonlight shimmered on the water, calm and silver. I pulled the old letter from my pocket, the one that had condemned me, the proof of lies and betrayal, and held it over the fire I'd built from wet branches. The paper caught slowly, curling at the edges before turning to ash. Watching it burn didn't erase the past, but it loosened its hold. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I just felt free. When I went back to the house, she was waiting on the porch. Her hair was down, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. "You burned it, didn't you?" she said softly. I nodded. She looked out toward the dark hills. Sometimes the only way to bury something is to stop digging it up. We sat in silence for a while, the night air cool and still. Her hand brushed mine, not by accident. I didn't pull away. There weren't any promises between us, no declarations. Just two people who'd seen enough of the world to know that love, when it came, didn't always have to be spoken to be real. Days turned to weeks. The lawman recovered and rode out one morning without a word, leaving behind only his empty coffee cup and the faint impression of peace. Life in Dry Creek settled back into its slow rhythm, the sound of hammers fixing fences, the lowing of cattle at dusk. The church bell ringing on Sundays, though few attended. The shack I'd once bought to hide in began to change too. The widow's boy helped me patch the roof and clear the weeds. Sometimes, when the sun set low over the valley, she'd bring supper and we'd sit outside, listening to the crickets and the gentle hum of the wind through the grass. It wasn't much, but it was more than I ever thought I'd have again. People in town started talking about me differently, no longer as the strange drifter who'd bought the old trapper's shack, but as the man who helped fix fences, who brought supplies to the widow when the bridge flooded, who looked after her boy like he was his own. They didn't know the whole story, and I never told it. Some things are better left resting quietly, like bones deep beneath the soil. One evening, months later, I stood at the ridge where the final storm had passed. The land below looked alive again, green grass returning, the creek glinting like a ribbon of light. The sky stretched wide and blue, the kind that makes you forget winter ever happened. I thought about all that had led me here, the war, the loss, the long years of silence, and realized that maybe this was what redemption looked like. Not glory, not applause, just peace. The widow joined me there, her hand slipping easily into mine. "Looks like the valley's breathing again," she said. I nodded, watching the wind move through the grass. "So am I replied. We stood there until the sun dipped behind the hills, the air soft and gold. For the first time since I'd come to Dry Creek, I didn't feel like a man living in someone else's shadow. I felt alive. In the end, I'd come here to bury my past. But the truth was, the past doesn't stay buried. It lingers until you face it, until you make peace with the ghosts and forgive yourself for the things you can't change. That's what the shack had taught me, what the widow and her boy had shown me. Somewhere out there, storms would still come, and the wind would still howl across the plains. But in this small corner of the world, there was warmth again, a second chance carved out of quiet mornings and the steady rhythm of living. I closed my eyes, letting the wind carry the last of the ashes from the letter into the open sky. The past had finally gone where it belonged, into memory, and what remained was something worth holding on to. When I turned back toward the house, the lantern glowed softly through the window, and the smell of bread drifted into the air. The door stood open, and for the first time in a long, long while I walked through it without hesitation.